January 11th, 1944. 11:14 hours. I observe a pale winter sky stretched over northern Germany. Thin cloud layers broken by cold sunlight that reflects sharply off aluminum wings. The air temperature at altitude is far below freezing. Visibility is clear enough to distinguish formation shapes at miles of distance. Sound does not travel here. Only vibration and instrument needles speak. For miles above the ground, near the town of Oschersleben, I find Major James Howard circling in a North American P-51B Mustang. His aircraft holds position above a bomber stream moving westward toward England. Beneath him, 60 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses maintain tight defensive boxes at roughly 23,000 feet. Their formation spacing is deliberate, calculated to overlap fields of .50 caliber defensive fire. Yet in that moment, they are exposed. I note movement to the east, multiple formations climbing toward interception altitude. The shapes resolve into Messerschmitt Bf-19s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s assembling in disciplined groups. Their climb profile suggests coordinated vectoring from ground control. Germany's radar network has tracked the bomber stream long before visual contact. This interception is neither spontaneous nor accidental. It is scheduled war. Howard watches. He does not yet descend at 33 years of age. He is not inexperienced, though his presence here reflects an evolving doctrine rather than an established one. Before arriving in Europe, he had flown in China with the American Volunteer Group and later U.S. Army Air Forces units, operating Curtiss P-40 fighters under entirely different conditions, different climate, different enemy tactics, different logistical constraints. His experience there had taught aggression, autonomy, and initiative. Europe demands something more structured, and yet structure remains incomplete. Must emphasize the strategic context shaping this encounter. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force had suffered heavy losses, attempting daylight precision bombing deep into Germany. Escort fighters, such as the Republic P-47, Thunderbolt possessed strength and firepower, but lacked sufficient range to remain with bombers throughout penetration and withdrawal phases. Lockheed's P-38 Lightning struggled with engine reliability and high-altitude handling in the European winter. As bombers crossed beyond escort range, interception losses rose sharply. Schweinfurt and Regensburg demonstrated this with brutal clarity. Aircraft destroyed, crews missing, formations broken. Planning staffs reconsidered the sustainability of daylight bombing operations. The arrival of the Merlin-powered Mustang represented possibility rather than certainty. Its range calculations suggested extended escort capability, but operational proof was limited. Engine performance in combat remained under evaluation. Maintenance crews were still adapting to servicing procedures unfamiliar to them. Pilots themselves debated whether the airframe's slender lines indicated efficiency or fragility. I have reviewed contemporary correspondence describing skepticism within command circles. Some regarded the long-range escort concept as dangerously optimistic. Howard's unit, the 354th Fighter Group, formed part of the first operational test. Their task was not merely combat participation, it was validation. His radio remains active, but largely quiet. Elements of his flight have drifted while pursuing separate contacts. Such dispersal is not unusual during interception phases, yet it leaves him momentarily solitary above the formation he protects. Below, German fighters commit to attack. The first pass begins at range. Cannon fire opens from outside tight defensive arcs. One bomber suffers immediate damage. Exhaust smoke trails darkly against white cloud. Another falls slightly out of alignment, engines compensating to maintain position. Defensive gunners respond, turret arcs crossing methodically. But interception pressure continues building. Howard descends. I observe his approach vector from altitude advantage. Airspeed rises beyond 400 miles per hour as gravity contributes to acceleration. He targets lead elements rather than peripheral aircraft, a choice reflecting tactical judgment. Aimed at disruption rather than attrition. Formation cohesion among interceptors depends upon leadership positioning. Gunfire flashes briefly, an attacking fighter breaks away trailing smoke. Howard climbs immediately after firing. He does not linger within converging defensive arcs. Momentum becomes separation. Separation becomes altitude regained. His presence alters geometry. Interceptors must now divide attention between bombers and escort. Decision cycles lengthen. Attack coordination loosens. I see German elements adjusting course to confront him directly. The imbalance of numbers is unmistakable. I refrain from romantic interpretation here. Numerical disparity alone does not determine combat outcome. Aircraft performance, energy state, pilot judgment, and moment-to-moment positioning govern survivability. Nevertheless, the tactical reality remains stark. One escort fighter now interposes itself between dozens of attackers and an entire bomber formation. Minutes pass with no simplification of the situation. Howard continues cycling through dive, fire, climb, reposition. Each engagement alters relative altitude and speed relationships. I notice increased dispersion among intercepting groups. Some pursue him. Others attempt renewed approach toward bombers but encounter harassment before closing distance. Within bomber aircraft, crews observe this evolving interaction through plexiglass panels and gun sights. Their environment remains constant engine vibration, interphone chatter, instrument monitoring, yet awareness of escort activity shapes morale and expectation. These men have previously experienced abandonment at range limits. Today they witness continued presence. Weather conditions remain stable, though cold intensifies mechanical stress. Metal contracts, lubricants thicken. Machine guns, exposed to airflow, risk malfunction under sustained firing cycles. Oxygen equipment demands constant monitoring. Fatigue accumulates invisibly, measured only through concentration effort. Howard does not disengage. I find it necessary here to remark upon the psychological dimension rather than dramatize it. Combat decision-making under such conditions is neither theatrical nor impulsive. Training, prior experience, and situational awareness converge in calculated risk acceptance. His continued engagement reflects evaluation, not recklessness. German formations reorganize. Attacks renew. Howard intercepts again. Time advances toward 11:20 hours. The engagement has not resolved. Instead, it deepens. Altitudes fluctuate within several thousand feet as opposing aircraft maneuver for advantage. Sun position affects visibility angles. Contrails form and dissipate fuel. Consumption proceeds continuously, regardless of tactical success. This variable alone imposes eventual conclusion upon any air combat engagement. I note that Howard's position relative to friendly territory remains unfavorable. Distance to safety exceeds immediate retreat margins if sustained combat continues. Yet withdrawal would expose bombers still far from escort. Coverage further west, he chooses continuation. From my vantage as historian, examining records, cockpit film fragments, and testimony, I detect no moment in which the sky simplifies or the choice becomes obvious. Instead, I see accumulation of minutes of mechanical strain, of mental calculation shaping events incrementally. Below, bomber formations hold course. Their mission objective already completed. They now seek only survival across hostile airspace. Defensive gun positions remain manned. Ammunition expenditure remains controlled above and around them. The escort action persists. By approximately 11:25 hours, patterns emerge. Interceptors increasingly attempt cooperative engagement structures intended to constrain Howard's movement. He responds through speed, extension, and repositioning. I observe several additional enemy aircraft withdrawing damaged. Exact tallies remain uncertain within immediate action. Confirmation belongs to later analysis. What matters in the moment is not counting, but continuity. He remains between attackers and bombers. The engagement extends beyond what planners might have anticipated for a single escort fighter operating independently. Minutes accumulate toward half an hour of sustained aerial confrontation, weather unchanged, visibility constant, mechanical wear increasing, and still he does not depart. I pause my observation. Here, not because the encounter concludes it does not, but because escalation intensifies beyond introductory framing. Events from this point forward involve depletion of ammunition, equipment degradation, and altered tactical behavior that demand careful sequential treatment. By 11:26 hours, I see the geometry tightening. Altitude separation between opposing elements has narrowed. German interceptors, no longer surprised by the Mustang's persistence, begin forming layered attack structures. I recognize these patterns from Luftwaffe tactical documentation, coordinated altitude brackets, designed to deny an opponent clear escape vectors. One group maintains higher position to compel reaction. Another approaches from below or offset bearing to intercept during extension. Howard climbs deliberately, maintaining vertical maneuver space. The Merlin engine responds with a steady, controlled note, audible only through cockpit vibration and instrument behavior. Supercharger settings are adjusted for altitude efficiency. These small, habitual motions, throttle, trim, mixture, reflect discipline rather than drama. His ammunition supply has already diminished. Sustained bursts against multiple targets produce inevitable expenditure. The Browning machine guns, mounted 3 per wing in the P-51B configuration, remain effective but sensitive to cold and thermal stress. Each firing cycle contributes microscopic wear. Under the temperature gradient encountered at altitude, stoppages are not unexpected. Shortly thereafter, I note evidence consistent with malfunction. One gun ceases contributing fire. Howard continues engagement without visible hesitation. The bomber formation beneath proceeds westward at reduced speed, its stability a contrast to surrounding maneuver. Crew testimony later confirms continuous visual contact with the lone escort fighter weaving through attacking aircraft. Their perspective differs from the pilots. They witness patterns rather than cockpit detail, yet consensus emerges in their accounts. The Mustang never fully disengaged. German pilots adapt again. Experience among them is significant. Many possess combat histories, extending across multiple theaters. Their approach becomes more patient, seeking to draw Howard into overcommitment. They attempt converging passes. They employ feints intended to force energy loss during pursuit. I observe him counter through selective engagement. He does not chase unnecessarily. He attacks leadership aircraft, then withdraws into altitude advantage before re-entering on altered vectors. This style reflects familiarity with asymmetric conditions. It conserves energy while sustaining disruption by approximately 11:30 hours. Ammunition reserves approach critical thresholds. Engagement duration alone dictates this. I avoid precise quantification where documentation varies, but multiple accounts indicate progressive reduction across gun banks. Additional stoppages occur. The number of operational guns decreases further. Simultaneously, fuel burn becomes unavoidable consideration. External tanks long since discarded, the aircraft operates solely on internal reserves. Escort distance from friendly lines still substantial. I recognize the calculation forming. Continued defense shortens. Safety margin. Yet the bomber stream remains exposed. German attacks renew, with emphasis on bomber penetration rather than duel with escort. Elements dive toward formation edges, seeking damaged or isolated aircraft. Howard responds by inserting himself directly along approach paths. Even when unable to fire effectively, proximity alone disrupts attack geometry. Interceptors forced into evasive maneuver lose firing solution and separation timing. Such influence is difficult to quantify numerically. It exists in moments, seconds gained, aim disrupted, concentration diverted. Combat outcome often hinges upon these margins. At approximately 11:34 hours, multiple observers record intense engagement at close range between Howard and attacking fighters. Several enemy aircraft suffer severe damage during this phase. Gun camera analysis conducted after landing provides partial confirmation, though I stress the historian's caution regarding exact enumeration. Fog of combat and differing witness perspectives complicate certainty. Nevertheless, cumulative effect remains indisputable. Interceptor cohesion deteriorates. I now observe final depletion of ammunition. Trigger actuation yields no further discharge. He continues maneuvering. From an analytical standpoint, this transition marks significant tactical shift. A fighter without armament normally disengages. Yet psychological impact of presence persists. German pilots cannot instantly confirm his status. They continue responding defensively to aggressive positioning. Howard employs intimidation through proximity pursuit. He closes distance behind individual fighters, forcing them into defensive maneuver rather than attack. This action consumes his own fuel, yet maintains protection of bomber formation. Cold intensifies. Reports describe cockpit heating irregularities. Extended exposure affects dexterity and cognitive endurance. Oxygen regulation requires attention. as pressure warnings intermittently signal fluctuation. These are not cinematic details. They are physiological realities shaping human performance in high-altitude combat. Time progresses toward 1140 hours, bomber formations. Approach regions nearer to Allied fighter coverage. Radar and communication networks coordinate relief interception from the west. Distant contacts eventually appear. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts approaching. Their arrival remains minutes away, but visible enough to alter enemy calculation. German elements. Concentrate briefly upon Howard himself. Multiple aircraft converge. He maintains evasive maneuver without fire capability, using altitude variation and cloud concealment to avoid decisive engagement. Structural damage to his aircraft has accumulated, though control remains functional. Fuel gauges indicate narrow margin. Engine operation continues stable, but reserve dwindles. I consider this stage perhaps the most critical psychologically sustained combat. Diminished resources, physical fatigue, and uncertainty regarding relief timing. By 1144 hours, German formations disengage. Thunderbolts nearing intercept range and bomber proximity to safer airspace reduce incentive to continue engagement. Enemy aircraft turn eastward. Abandoning pursuit, Howard reforms above the bombers briefly before separating to return west independently. Escort replacement integrates with formation. The immediate crisis ends not with spectacle but with withdrawal, an anticlimactic yet decisive conclusion, typical of aerial warfare. He lands later with minimal fuel remaining. Ground examination reveals damage consistent with prolonged exposure to hostile fire. Gun camera evidence, mission records, and bomber crew testimony collectively reconstruct the encounter. Recognition follows through formal channels. Recommendations proceed. Award determination eventually confirms extraordinary distinction. I conclude this portion of observation with emphasis on restraint. Heroic interpretation belongs to public narrative. My responsibility remains assessment, grounded in documentation. One pilot, one aircraft, sustained engagement against superior numbers. 60 bombers returned. Strategic significance extended beyond individual combat. Validation of long-range escort doctrine. Reinforcement of Mustang operational adoption. An adjustment of tactical aggressiveness among Allied fighter units. Yet history also retains quieter dimension. Crew visits to express gratitude. Personal acknowledgement exchanged between survivors and escort pilot. Such interactions, preserved in letters and recollections, remind me that operational statistics ultimately represent individual lives, continued the sky over Germany, but demonstration of capability, endurance, and tactical evolution shaped through conflict. I record it as such. In reviewing the operational record after the aircraft had returned to England, I find the atmosphere on the ground markedly different from the violence of the engagement itself. Airfields in East Anglia functioned with procedural regularity. Engines cooled. Armorers checked ammunition belts. Intelligence officers assembled mission debrief notes, with pencils worn short by constant use. Combat events, however extraordinary, were filtered through paperwork, comparison, and verification. Major Howard's Mustang rolled to a halt with only modest ceremony. Mechanics approached first, as they always did, looking not for legend but for damage, leaks, and structural compromise. They counted punctures along the fuselage skin, inspected control surfaces, and examined the wing roots for cannon impact distortion. Metal fatigue and control cable integrity mattered more to them than narratives forming elsewhere. The pilot himself provided only concise description. This brevity aligns with many combat debrief transcripts of the period. Aviators were trained to relay actionable information rather than personal interpretation. Engagement altitude bands. Enemy aircraft types observed. Ammunition expenditure. System malfunctions. Approximate duration. These details entered typed reports. Meanwhile, testimony from bomber crews accumulated independently. Statements gathered across multiple aircraft presented consistent description. A single Mustang maintaining presence among attacking fighters for extended duration, well beyond typical escort separation points. Such convergence of witness observation carried weight. Cross-referencing squadron logs isolated the aircraft identity. Gun camera film, though imperfect and fragmented, corroborated combat interaction at several moments. The official chain of recognition proceeded through command channels with unusual speed. Recommendations for decoration required careful documentation. Exaggerated claims were routinely rejected. In this instance, supporting material proved extensive. The award eventually approved represented the highest distinction available within United States military honors. It remains notable, and I state this as historical fact rather than ceremonial emphasis, that this engagement produced the only Medal of Honor awarded to a fighter pilot in the European theater during the war. Recognition, however, does not preclude analysis. I must address the broader operational consequence. By early 1944, Allied strategic bombing depended upon consistent penetration capability deep into German territory. Escort fighters capable of accompanying bombers across full mission distance shifted aerial balance significantly. The Merlin-powered Mustang's validation and combat accelerated conversion schedules among fighter groups. Maintenance infrastructure adapted. Pilot transition training expanded. Within months, Mustang presence over central Germany increased substantially. This altered interception calculus. German defensive forces now faced opposition throughout engagement windows rather than only near border zones. Fighter losses mounted. Interception efficiency decreased. Bombing campaign sustainability improved. I caution against assigning singular causation to any individual sortie. Strategic transformation results from cumulative developments, yet demonstration events, such as Howard's engagement, influenced confidence, planning, and doctrinal emphasis. They mattered. Psychological dimensions extended on both sides. Bomber crews increasingly trusted that escort coverage would persist. Interceptor pilots encountered opponents more frequently at altitude, rather than encountering isolated bomber formations. Tactical adaptation followed. War in the air remained dynamic rather than static. Howard continued operational service after this event, flying additional missions within the theater. His conduct remained consistent with professional expectation rather than shaped by public recognition. Combat pilots rarely possessed the luxury of dwelling upon singular engagements. Subsequent assignments demanded equal attention. Records indicate further aerial victories credited during later sorties. Eventually, he departed combat operations and transitioned into stateside and post-war service roles, including test flying responsibilities during early jet development periods. He retired decades later, his wartime actions integrated into institutional memory. The bomber crews whose aircraft he shielded completed their own mission cycles. Some survived the war, others did not. I find it necessary to acknowledge this balance. Survival in one engagement did not guarantee survival in subsequent ones. Statistical risk remained present across operations conducted over Europe until hostilities ceased. Yet correspondence preserved in archives reveals enduring gratitude directed toward the escort pilot they identified. Several crew members visited his unit shortly after the mission to offer thanks in person. Such gestures existed outside formal reporting structures. They occupy quieter corners of historical record, handwritten letters, recollections shared years afterward. Through these, I observe recognition, expressed not through rhetoric, but through presence. The air war itself evolved rapidly during 1944. Mustang deployment widened. Fighter sweeps extended beyond escort roles into offensive patrols designed to engage German aircraft on the ground and in transit. Attrition of Luftwaffe fighter strength accelerated. By late stages of the conflict, Allied air superiority over Western Europe had become pronounced. No single engagement achieved this outcome. Rather, accumulation of tactical successes, technological integration, industrial production, and human endurance combined to produce it. Reflecting upon January 11th, I resist temptation toward embellishment. The encounter demonstrates interplay between individual decision and systemic context. Howard did not act in isolation from doctrine. He acted within emerging doctrine, still testing itself. His experience from earlier theaters influenced his willingness to maintain aggressive posture. His aircraft's capabilities enabled extended participation. Bomber formation resilience provided defensive foundation. Relief fighters approached through coordinated planning. History seldom presents pure singularity. It presents convergence. When I consider the sky above Oschersleben that morning, I do not envision spectacle. I imagine cold air pressing against cockpit glass, instrument needles moving with quiet precision, radio transmissions clipped and brief, sunlight reflecting from aluminum surfaces at shifting angles. machines interacting through momentum and distance. Each pilot calculating survival probabilities moment by moment. Silence followed the engagement's conclusion. Not literal silence, for engines continued, but operational quiet in which routine resumed. Aircraft landed, reports filed, equipment serviced. War continued into the following day. This, ultimately, forms my closing assessment. One pilot sustained defense of a bomber formation. Under numerical disadvantage, did not redefine warfare alone. It did, however, illustrate emerging capability at a decisive period. It demonstrated range once considered impractical. It reinforced tactical aggression under escort responsibility. It contributed to institutional confidence, guiding subsequent operational planning and beyond institutional effect. It preserved lives on that winter morning, hundreds of airmen who returned across the channel rather than descending by parachute or flame into hostile territory. I record the event with measured respect, not as legend, not as spectacle, but as documented evidence of human decision and machine capability intersecting within the disciplined violence of aerial war, January 1944, above a landscape far removed from those who would later remember it. When I reviewed the engagement in its entirety, the raw logs, the gun camera fragments, the debrief transcripts, the later recollections, I find that distance and time clarifies certain elements while obscuring others. This is the inevitable condition of historical examination. Not every trajectory can be reconstructed. Not every exchange can be timed to the second. Combat compresses perception and scatters documentation. Yet enough remains intact to understand the essential structure of what had occurred that morning. The bomber stream crossed into safer airspace without catastrophic loss. This outcome must be understood in context. A formation of 60 heavy bombers deep within defended German territory represented a target of exceptional value. Each aircraft carried crew, equipment, and strategic payload capacity not easily replaced. Interception success could inflict material and psychological damage beyond immediate destruction. Avoidance of loss under such circumstances constituted operational achievement of considerable significance. The Mustang's continued presence contributed measurably to that. Avoidance, I emphasize again, not through myth, but through tactical influence, demonstrable in witness statements and engagement geometry. Enemy attack vectors disrupted. Formation cohesion among interceptors weakened. Time bought. Distance covered. Distance mattered. By early afternoon, the returning bombers descended toward their respective fields across eastern England. Landing procedures unfolded with procedural familiarity. Flaps deployed. Throttles eased. Wheels lowered into airflow, accompanied by mechanical vibration. Crews taxied. Engines cut. Silence, replacing mechanical thunder in gradual increments. Debriefing rooms received them. Inside those rooms, I imagine, based on surviving notes, a mixture of exhaustion and matter-of-fact recounting. Aircrew culture of the period favored understatement. Descriptions centered on technical observation rather than personal drama, yet repeated references appear regarding the escort fighters' persistence. That consistency is notable. It demonstrates how profoundly the event registered among observers accustomed to danger. Elsewhere, maintenance personnel began preparing aircraft for subsequent missions. Bomb racks inspected, hydraulic lines checked, propeller blades examined for microfractures invisible without close attention. War rarely paused for reflection. The machinery demanded readiness again within hours. I turn now to the broader interpretive dimension, what later generations might call legacy. This term risks distortion if applied loosely. Therefore, I approach cautiously. Howard's actions did not transform fighter doctrine overnight. Evolution occurred through committees, test evaluations, and accumulated operational reports. However, episodes demonstrating feasibility accelerated acceptance. Confidence in long-range escorts strengthened. Tactical guidance began encouraging fighters to engage interceptors proactively rather than adhering strictly to closed protective formation patterns. This represented a philosophical shift. Instead of passively guarding bombers, escorts increasingly sought to deny the enemy opportunity entirely. Offensive counter-air concepts gained prominence. Mustang groups executed sweeps ahead of bomber streams, intercepting German fighters before they reached attack positions. The sky itself became contested space rather than corridor. Such developments contributed materially to attrition of German fighter strength through 1944. Combined with industrial limitations, fuel shortages, and pilot training decline within the Luftwaffe, the cumulative effect reduced interception effectiveness by year's end. Strategic bombing thus proceeded with increasing survivability. I caution against attributing causation simplistically. Air warfare outcomes emerged from complex interaction among production capacity, intelligence, radar coordination, pilot replacement pipelines, and countless engagements, large and small. Yet individual actions occasionally serve as points of demonstration within that system practical evidence influencing perception and policy. This encounter functioned as one such point. Howard himself resumed operational routine after recognition ceremonies concluded. Archival evidence indicates no dramatic alteration in personal conduct or reporting tone. He continued missions, participated in tactical briefings, and fulfilled duties consistent with rank and assignment. This continuity illustrates a truth often overlooked. Decorated individuals remained professionals embedded within institutional structure rather than detached symbols. Post-war years carried him into roles shaping aviation development. Test flying demanded analytical precision distinct from combat reflex, yet related through understanding of aircraft behavior at performance margins. His later career contributed quietly to evolving airpower frameworks during transitional technological eras. He eventually withdrew from active service, living decades beyond the conflict that had defined his public reputation. Such longevity permits perspective. War compresses identity around moments. Life expands beyond them. As historian, I consider also those German pilots engaged that day, their names largely absent from popular recounting, their perspective preserved, primarily through loss records and tactical analysis. They, too, operated under discipline, responding to guidance, confronting uncertainty in hostile airspace. Historical integrity requires recognition that conflict comprised opposing professionals, executing duty under different flags. Their experience, though adversarial forms, inseparable component of the event's reality. Thus, I approach conclusion not through triumphal tone, but through measured summation. On January 11, 1944, above central Germany, a long-range escort fighter engaged multiple interceptors over extended duration, while accompanying a vulnerable bomber formation. Mechanical reliability, pilot experience, and tactical initiative allowed sustained interference with enemy attack cycles. Ammunition depletion did not terminate participation. Maneuver presence alone continued affecting engagement outcome until relief forces approached. Bombers returned largely intact. Documentation confirmed unusual persistence and effect. This is the event. It occupies a specific coordinate within the immense tapestry of the Second World War. Neither isolated miracle nor insignificant anecdote. It illustrates interaction between emerging technology and individual agency. It reflects conditions of altitude, temperature, fatigue, calculation, and risk that defined aerial combat in that era. It demonstrates how outcomes often hinge not upon spectacle, but upon endurance measured in minutes, miles, and remaining fuel. When I close the record, I do so without embellishment. I imagine again the winter sky, bright, cold, and indifferent. Aircraft passing through it left no trace visible hours later. Contrails dispersed, sound faded, geography resumed stillness. Only documentation and memory carried forward what occurred there. History preserves such moments carefully, not to celebrate violence, not to construct legend, but to understand how human judgment and engineered machines intersected under extraordinary pressure, and how on that particular morning the balance tilted toward survival for hundreds who might otherwise have been lost. I end my observation there in examining the longer arc of events that followed. I find that the significance of that winter engagement cannot be measured solely by aircraft destroyed or formations preserved. Air warfare, particularly in the European theater of the Second World War, evolved through demonstration. Concepts debated in planning rooms required validation. Under combat conditions, before acceptance could be secured, The Merlin-powered Mustang existed initially as a calculated risk. Its aerodynamic efficiency suggested range. Its wing promised reduced drag. Yet, until sustained escort operations proved feasible beyond theoretical projection, skepticism persisted within command channels. Engineers design capability, combat establishes credibility. The events of January 1944 contributed to that credibility. Operational reports compiled in the weeks following showed increasing confidence among escort planners regarding penetration, depth, and loiter endurance. Escort boundaries extended incrementally. Fighter groups, transitioning onto the Mustang airframe, expanded presence over central German targets previously approached with caution. By spring, escort coverage reached distances once regarded as impractical. I observe measurable change in interception outcomes. German fighter units encountered Allied escorts earlier along approach corridors and more persistently during withdrawal phases. Engagement conditions shifted. Instead of selecting isolated bomber elements, interceptors frequently faced defending fighters already positioned for opposition. Attrition rates rose accordingly. This was not solely technological displacement, it was temporal displacement. Time, minutes gained by extended range, altered confrontation points within the airspace network. Those minutes affected survival probabilities across entire formations. I also consider the mechanical culture surrounding the aircraft itself. Ground crews developed familiarity with the Packard-built Merlin engine and its maintenance characteristics. Fuel system management, supercharger calibration, and cooling regulation required procedural adaptation distinct from radial engine platforms previously serviced. Their expertise underpinned operational reliability. The pilot's performance depended upon these unseen contributions. Thus, historical assessment extends beyond cockpit. Training doctrine likewise evolved. Fighter pilots were increasingly encouraged to think not only in terms of positional escort, but in disruption of enemy initiative. Engagement philosophy emphasized seizing tactical momentum, altitude, speed, and initiative regarded as interchangeable currencies. The experience demonstrated by Howard aligned naturally with this philosophy, reinforcing its institutional adoption. It is important, however, that I avoid retrospective certainty. At the time, outcomes remained contingent. Whether mechanical failure, navigational error, or simple chance could undo planning with equal efficiency. The European air war remained volatile until its final months. Nevertheless, the cumulative direction of change is visible. By late 1944, long-range escort fighters had become routine companions to heavy bomber formations, crossing deep into German territory. Industrial centers, once protected by distance-faced sustained exposure, interception resistance persisted, yet the balance of initiative had shifted materially. I return, finally, to the human dimension, the element most resistant to abstraction. Within archival correspondence, I find restrained gratitude expressed by airmen who witnessed that morning's defense. Their language is modest. They do not speak in grand historical terms. They speak of return, of survival, of families unseen during deployment. Such documents remind me that large-scale strategic analysis ultimately rests upon individual continuity of life. Major Howard himself offered little embellishment in later recounting. His descriptions remained concise, technical, and largely devoid of theatrical emphasis. This restraint reinforces my own approach in documenting the engagement. History serves understanding best when it resists spectacle. Of this episode, I do so with recognition that the sky over Europe hosted thousands of encounters never recorded with comparable clarity. Yet occasionally documentation converges, logs, testimony, film, and outcome aligning sufficiently to illuminate a particular moment. This was one of those moments. A winter sky, a vulnerable formation, an experimental escort concept still proving itself, a pilot who chose continuation where withdrawal remained possible from such intersections. Doctrine evolves, machines earn trust, and lives proceed beyond what might otherwise have ended. I record it not as myth, but as evidence, preserved, carefully, studied soberly, and remembered with the measured respect owed to all who inhabited that cold air on that January morning. If you loved this story and want more history that shocks, inspires, and motivates, subscribe to Rising Warfare, like this video, and explore the incredible tales we uncover. More amazing content is coming, and trust me, you don't want to miss it.